Hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Erin Tinnen with the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. Today's webinar is Partnering with Other Systems, the 9th of the webinar series, Building Trauma-Informed Services for Children, Youth, and Parents Impacted by Domestic Violence. Our trainer today will be Susan Blumenfeld, MSW, LCSW, and Child Trauma Training Director for the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. Before we get started, I'll go over some of the technical details of the WebEx software that we will be using for today's webinar. Many of these details are explained on the Using this WebEx System tab in the upper left-hand side of your screen. Please be aware that your screen might look depending on, oopsies, whether you're using a Mac or a PC. On the right-hand side of the screen, there are multiple boxes. The second from the top is the chat feature. This feature will allow you to provide feedback and share resources with your fellow colleagues, as well as get in contact with the trainers or myself if you have any questions regarding the training content. You may contact Jennifer Curley, also with the center, if you have any questions troubleshooting the WebEx software. To do this, click the down-facing arrow and select the person you would like to contact. You will see a lot of options for this session, but you'll want to select all participants if you'd like to respond to a question from the trainer or contact me anytime during the session. You should click on Jennifer Curley to privately contact her if you're in need of troubleshooting the WebEx software. So let's test this chat feature. Will everyone please go to the chat box, click on all participants, type in the program that you're calling from, and then press enter. Excellent. Perfect. I'll let you all continue to do that as I explain some more of the features. While folks can get a lot out of the chat feature, there are times when it moves really quickly and can feel a little bit distracting. If this is true for you, you can feel free to minimize the chat box by clicking the arrow next to where it says chat. You can always open it again with the same arrow if you choose. We will be providing live captioning during this webinar. Below the chat box, there is a media viewer box. This will contain the captions. If you do not want to see the captions, click on the down-facing arrow next to the word Media Viewer, the same way you might if you want to hide the chat box. At the end of the webinar, you'll be taken to a very brief evaluation. Please take a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better. If you get disconnected at any point, return to the email you received with the original webinar link and re-enter the training. Sometimes the sound cuts out due to internet connection, so feel free to call in if that's a problem for you. If you're experiencing technical difficulties and are unable to contact Jennifer Curley, you may call WebEx Tech Support to resolve any additional issues. That phone number, which we will also post in the chat box, is 1-866-229-3239. Again, thank you so much for joining us today, and I will turn the training over to Susan.
Thanks so much, Erin, and welcome everybody. I see we have folks from around the country and somebody from Turkey that's joining us, so that's awesome. So welcome to our 9th webinar in the series, and this is put on by our center. And if you haven't had a chance to look at our website, please do so. And we have lots of great resources, and we're here to help you with questions and resources that you might need. So I don't know what the weather is like everywhere else, but in Chicago it's still very, very cold, and we have not seen the first sign of spring yet. And I thought it would be lovely, at least for those of us that are enduring the cold, that seems endless, to look at a beautiful picture of spring crocuses and to make us hopeful about what's coming. So with that in mind, let's do what we always do on the webinars, which is to take a moment to come together into the present moment and take a deep breath and begin to center and join in. So if you'd like to do so at this point, get really comfortable in your chairs or wherever you are, shake out your arms and legs a little bit, and then if you choose to, take a deep breath in through your nose, and then a breath out through your mouth, and you can use that audible sound, ha, which just helps us kind of clear out old energy and is calming. So let's take a couple of breaths together. So breath in and out. and out. One more. In and out. So I hope you feel that you have fully arrived at the moment here for our webinar. As always, feel free to doodle, take breaks, stretch. If there's material that comes up that feels very evocative to you and you want to take a break from it, please feel free to do so. As you know, all of these webinars will have been archived, so you can go back to them at any time. So welcome, and I'm glad you're here. So today's webinar, we're going to talk about partnering across some of the major child and family serving systems that affect the children and families we're working with. So early intervention, mental health, schools, the court system, and the child welfare system. I want to say about the latter that our child welfare laws really vary from state to state, and some of us, many of us are mandated reporters, others may not be. So if I say some things that are relevant for mandated reporters and you know you are not one, then just listen in, okay? So I'd like to invite us to reflect a little bit about what the state of your role in your program and organization might be in regards to partnering across child and family serving systems. Who do you typically partner with? And we know that having a web of services is so critically important to the families that we're serving. We know we can't provide services in isolation, and that we have to really be reliant not only on our community partners, but also on larger systems such as the court system and the child welfare system that operate in our communities. And it's also so, I think one of the most important aspects about partnering is that it gives us the opportunity to learn about other systems on behalf of the families we're working with, but also to educate them about the dynamics and the impact of domestic violence on survivors and their children. So let's dive into thinking about the importance and the challenges of partnerships. And I have to say, over a long career before coming to the center, that one of the hardest things that I was involved with was building up partnerships and alliances and collaborations, both locally and sometimes at the state level, depending on what my role was. But it could also really be so rewarding when you built up a relationship with a provider and you could get a family in to see them, even though we know we're often working with resources that are so scarce. And so much of this also depends on where we're delivering our services. So there are vast differences if we're operating in a more rural area or an urban area or a suburban area. I think back on when I worked at a large family service agency in the Chicago area, and we served maybe 30 different communities in one of the positions that I had. And so there were multiple schools and school systems that we were interfacing with, and it would have been impossible for me to have a relationship with every single school. But like many do, we had 3 or 4 different offices throughout the area that we were serving, and we made strategic kinds of alliances and partnerships that really were beneficial to the families that we were serving. And I think that building and maintaining those relationships is really a continual process, partially because we establish a relationship and somebody leaves, or there's a new municipal government that's operating, etc. So it takes so much time and resources, and we do have to think strategically. And I think one of the things that I feel really passionately about is that when we're looking at domestic violence services and thinking about partnerships, that sometimes we're not always thinking about children and the services that children are going to need and benefit from, or we feel like we don't have the resources. I am hearing a little feedback on the line, so a little bit of an echo. That may be my own microphone. I hope nobody else is bothered by it. So as I said, you know, and I think we've all experienced this, that establishing those alliances and relationships and partnerships can also be a source of frustration and an energy drain for us, or we may have funding streams that are small that come and go. So I think it takes more, though, than the individual relationships that we might develop as frontline providers, and it also takes agency vision and leadership and the program as a whole to be invested and to support this work and to make those real critical, important relationships with the community and community providers. And I think that sometimes our opportunities come when there's a crisis. I mean, I'm thinking about this from the standpoint of a domestic violence program where there's been a death and we get called in to a school system, et cetera. So there may be, you know, a crisis that's taking place, and then that becomes a way in which we have information and resources that we can give. We may get in to do more preventative services, for instance, in schools after we've come in and been helpful. So there are those sorts of opportunities that present themselves that is so important to balance and get ready for. We'll talk about confidentiality a little more in another minute. I want to talk about the last dot point on here. I think in recent years there's been a trend for organizations to be upfront about their mission and values and to have that transparent and written and accessible for everybody, which I think is great. I also think that when we start to look at partnering across systems, between systems, that we come up against very different norms and ways of operating and missions. And so it can be challenging to look for our commonalities and what we can do together to benefit children and families. And sometimes it does mean compromising, letting a process unfold, but at the same time maintaining the integrity of what our beliefs and values are as we do this work. So when I think about this from the perspective of domestic violence providers, that we're always going to hold that layer that is thinking about violence in the context of social justice and oppression and gender, et cetera. So that's one of the layers that we incorporate and we hold close to us. That it can be a very different situation if we're interfacing with schools that are thinking more about academic performances and standards, or if we're thinking about child welfare providers who are really looking at well-being and safety and permanency for children. So we're going to look at where those intersections are and what comes up for us. But I hope this is getting you to think, again, because I'm sure you think about this day to day, about what's come up for you and what kinds of things you might do to enrich those relationships and partnerships. Okay. I think it's so important. We're very careful, I think, in the domestic violence community to respect the privacy and confidentiality of survivors because there are some real dangers that can happen when we don't. At the same time, I've seen folks in the mental health field ask for these long, kind of undated written releases. And so I think that it's really important when we are going to share information, I'm thinking more in terms of children right now, that we've discussed that thoroughly with the parent and what it's about, what we're going to share, and to make sure that they understand what they're agreeing to. You know, the benefits of this are that we get to share information that hopefully is going to really help this child and family or children. And then just a caveat about being careful in terms of what gets shared even with potential allies such as prosecuting attorneys if there's a criminal case going on. And Patricia Van Horn, who wrote the original curriculum, who was also an attorney, talked about the fact that if we're not careful, as frontline staff, we can become part of the de facto team, and any communication that we've had with a survivor can be then aired in court. So just a cautionary note there. And then the last dot, I think is so important because we do have a perspective that we can share around domestic violence and the dynamics and how it impacts survivors and children that folks that we're partnering with may not have as accessible to them. I also think what I've learned over the years is that just as we talked in the last webinar about engaging in sensitive conversations with parents and caregivers, that we have to be attuned to where they're at in the moment when we share things, I think the same really holds true for providers that we're partnering with. And so we have to take that opportunity when it comes up, when we see that the person that we have a relationship with or that we're building a relationship with is open to taking in our perspective and information, and how that might be useful to us in really assuring common goals that we have for a child or children in the family. And you know, I have found personally that of course, all of our relationships are different, but I can remember with some of the teachers that I worked with who started out with, I want this kid to have medication. This kid's hyperactive. It's disrupting my classroom. I can't get anything done, et cetera, et cetera. And over a period of time, remember building a relationship with this teacher and talking some more about what the traumatic experiences had been for this child and what that might be about. And then she really became open to considering some other ways in which we might think about ways that she could maintain what she needed to in the classroom, but also be more attuned to and sensitive to this child. So sometimes things that seem insurmountable, where, you know, there's this sort of definite stance where a teacher says this child needs to be on medication, and we have a very different, you know, viewpoint, can shift over time. Okay. So I'm sure you've been thinking about some of the systems and partners, community partners that you've been working with. But I'd like you to bring to mind a family or families you are working with now or have worked with who are in need of child-related referrals. Maybe think about what's worked for you, what's been difficult. I would love people to share those experiences. Maybe people have a few remarks that they'd want to put into chat. But it's helpful for us to think about what's that process been like, and to be really thoughtful and mindful around that. And one of the hopes that I have is that our programs are prepared to anticipate a wide range of needs that children and families may have. I think that we're really excellent at providing legal supports, looking at basic benefits, and like food and other things that families need, working on housing, looking at employment, and a lot of that effort, and a lot of that effort's absolutely critical, and educating about domestic violence as well. But sometimes children can be an afterthought, and we're not as prepared to think about those systems and what we need. And so I really want to encourage you, if you're not already, to think about how you might build that in to your program and your services. Okay. So this is very similar, and for those of you that have been on other webinars, you're going to see that I'm layering in some information, some of which we have covered before, but it's that whole process of building an alliance with a parent and thinking with them about making referrals. So parents may come to us and say, I want this or that for my child, but they may not. And so we have to think about what's going to be helpful. And I think as both a parent myself and as a provider, any system can be intimidating, and it really can take energy and concentration and wading through language or terminology that's not familiar to us to be successful when we're trying to advocate for our children. So I'm thinking that, if I'm in the midst of a contentious custody process and I'm feeling quite vulnerable, it may be harder for me in that moment to muster up what I need to also carry through on meeting with school personnel. And if my child needs an individual educational plan, going through that process and thinking about that. So I think if we're mindful of that as we're supporting survivors and their families, I think that's helpful. And sometimes for all of us, we're not always sure what we need or how to advocate, or and we may not know in the moment what we think is going to be most supportive to us. So I would encourage you to have those conversations with parents to find out if they'd like to talk about it, think about it, so that it's really a process that feels paced and that is collaborative and exploratory. So, for instance, if I'm going to consider making a referral for mental health services, hopefully I know who within my community I think can provide the kind of mental health services that are going to match well to what I think this child and family might need. And after I've done my homework with that and maybe hopefully have a relationship, then I want to ask the parent, have they had any prior experiences with the mental health system, let's say, or services? And if so, what have they been like? And then I think what can happen is that we can surface in that conversation whatever fears or concerns they might have, or expectations. They might have negative expectations based on a prior experience. And then I think the next kind of step in this process of making referrals is really thinking together and articulating what the parent hopes is going to come out of this referral. What do they want? What do they think their child needs? And then anticipating what this whole process might be like for them. And then thinking about giving strategies. So whether or not adults have experienced domestic violence or other trauma in their lives, most parents, when they go through a school process, for instance, talk about how emotional and difficult it can be if their child has special needs. And so if we think about what might come up for parents in this situation, including feelings of blame or shame, then It's also helpful to, hopefully you've worked on strategies for self-regulation and relaxation, and to be able to think with parents about what might be centering or grounding for them if they find themselves in the midst of having really strong feelings and reactions. So to reflect on that in advance and to anticipate what might come up and to normalize it as well. Okay. So I've shared these before. I think this does come up for parents. Is my child okay? Am I a good enough parent? Anytime we're talking about outside referrals. And in situations where there has been a pattern of domestic violence, often, in my experience, the protective parent feels guilty or ashamed and blames themselves for their child's behavior or responses. And so that can, make any of us feel a little more bristly or defensive about them. If I am considering this for my child, then that means there really is something wrong with me in the way I've parented. And often this can then reinforce what the abusive partner has said as part of that whole process of emotional denigration and abuse, for lack of a better word, that goes on. So I talked before about, or I mentioned building a collaborative alliance with the parent, and so asking ourselves who's holding the concern. If it's not the parent, then beginning to explore that with them by asking them, by sharing what our concern or observations have been, and asking them if they share that or if they've noticed it, and if they're worried about it as well. Sometimes it might be a silent concern that a parent's holding, but until somebody else voices it, it kind of is not it's not something that comes to the surface. And then often there may be different perspectives that we hold, and so that's part of the process then of exploring together. So I'm going to segue now to talking about one of the first systems that I think is so important, which is the early intervention system. And every single state has a set of services for early intervention that are low or no cost for families. And the only caveat is that the child has to be seen before before they turn 3 years of age to receive these services. And I've talked some in past webinars about the impact of traumatic experiences early in life and the importance of protective factors such as the secure attachment with the nonviolent or protective parent. But we do know that exposure to violence can make it difficult for children to feel secure enough to explore their environments. So we may see developmental delays because children don't feel that sort of natural curiosity is really bound up in a lot of fear and lack of curiosity then about what's going on, or the environment doesn't feel safe to explore. So I think we need to think about that. And also we do need to separate out what might be a temporary regression in a young child's behavior and what really looks like it's more of an ongoing delay or risk for this child's development. So, I mean, what I'm thinking in this situation is that sometimes when young children come into shelter with their parent, that they can look very regressed. They may stop talking. If they were just toilet trained, they lose that function, or if they're just beginning to do all of that. If they were crawling, they want to be held, etc. So I think that in thinking about early intervention services for children 3 or younger, that we have to have within our mind a sense of what do we think is in a wide range of what we would consider normative, typical development. So an example might be that we see a child who's already a year and a half, and they're not even cruising around furniture, holding on to get around the room or walking yet. We might have some concerns. So we're thinking about what we call motor milestones. We're also thinking about social and emotional development. And what I started with in terms of fears around exploring one's environment can lead to kind of cognitive delays in children. So it's really helpful to have those relationships in place and to be able to talk with a parent about considering a referral for early intervention. And that can be for families that are coming into your center-based services or if they're in shelter. One of the shelters that I worked with in the Chicago area really kind of took hold of the idea of the early intervention system. And after I'd been, I think I was out there doing some training, they decided to develop a relationship with one of their local early intervention providers. And it was a wonderful partnership because that provider would come on site to the shelter to do screenings, I think maybe every couple weeks or once a month. It was really so helpful and beneficial to the families and to the staff in the domestic violence shelter as well, to kind of be able to think about what we meant when we were talking about delays or risks to the child's development. One of the things in my work that I've seen over the years, and I've heard others talk about anecdotally, is that many children who have experienced severe and ongoing domestic violence have speech and language delays and can really benefit from getting help with articulation and speech. And obviously, you can have speech and language delays and not experience domestic violence. But it's something to think about because I've worked with a number of families where children are 2.5 or so, and they understand, perfectly what's going on, but when they go to express themselves, it's really difficult to understand them. Their mothers usually can understand what they're saying, but the folks around them can't, and other children can't. So, and then that can lead to issues around their relating to peers and playing and all that. Okay. So I talked in more depth about mental health referrals and kinds of problems and issues that might arise for children affected by DV and other traumatic experiences in a prior webinar, which was webinar 6 on responding to the needs of children and families impacted by DV. So I would recommend you may want to go back and listen to that, or if you haven't already, because I'm going to go through this a little more quickly. If there are questions, I'll be happy to take them. But so really we make referrals in kind of based on how well or how poorly a child may be doing in their day-to-day lives and in their development. So if children's sleep is disrupted, which is it's a big, big issue for so many kids where they have nightmares. They're afraid to go to sleep, or they wake up during the night. And for school-age kids, they may be very tired because they're not getting enough sleep. And all of that sort of snowballs. And then we know as adults and for children who are still growing too, that it makes us more irritable, and it's harder to concentrate, and et cetera. So again, if we're seeing issues that are really impacting a child and how they're doing, and it's a shift for them. Maybe they were doing pretty well, and then there was a particular incident that came up in the home that was really, really frightening, and they become very, they have all these trauma-related responses. So the other thing that we might see that I think would be worth considering a mental health referral is if a child is continually engaging in post-traumatic play, not right after an event has taken place, but over time. And I've talked about this before. So post-traumatic play is different than regular, what I'll call regular play, because it doesn't lead to a sense of mastery or pleasure in any way. And play itself, being able to symbolically recreate your world and what's important to you, your inner world and your external world, is an achievement. So when children engage in post-traumatic play, they may be replaying a particular memory or aspect of a traumatic event that, or something that they felt or experienced. And it has this kind of unrelenting, somber quality to it. And as somebody that has done mental health play therapy with children, the therapist can't really get in there to change the scenario. The child is almost in this frozen state, playing this out over and over again. And so it's not helpful to just let kids play like that. And it really does represent a form of what I would call dissociation, where the child is really not in the room in some ways, and they're just playing out something that's been very frightening to them, where they were helpless and didn't have control. And again, I mean, you wouldn't just refer a child for this without thinking about the context of whatever else was going on for them. Oh, somebody just asked, could I give an example of post-traumatic play? Yes, I will give an example. So I was playing with this 5-year-old. We had a dollhouse out, and the child kept taking figures and having them fall off the roof. And this happened over and over again. And it wasn't an actual reenactment of what had gone on, but it was close enough to a parent having been pushed downstairs, and the DV survivor was injured. And so the play just kept going, and so I guess that would be one example. Okay. If the child's engaging in self-harming behavior, then that's a really clear warning sign to us. So that could be, depending on the age of the child, biting, scratching, pulling out their hair, as kids get older, cutting. And we might also see and hear children either drawing about or talking about. Sometimes I've seen this more in terms of teachers reporting this, but kids that have suicidal thoughts. And so obviously we want to be able to pay attention to that. I think for teenagers we see it more, and because teenagers have, if they're driving, they've got access, maybe they'll have access to cars. And so we see situations, again, where a teenager may be driving recklessly while under the influence of alcohol, let's say, or engaging in other behaviors beyond the kind of risk-taking that teens do in general, that's harmful. And then I think somebody was asking about the self-harming behaviors. I've seen very young children actually scratch themselves and bite themselves. their bodies. That's what I've seen in young kids. Or they may turn some of that aggression outward, but I'm in terms of the self-harming part. And usually with young kids then, that can also be accompanied by verbalizations that they have about themselves. And you just get the sense that these kids don't feel very lovable and don't like themselves very much. And then, of course, we're concerned if children seem to, not only through post-traumatic play, but at other times seem to dissociate and lose track of time and place. And again, I learned this many, many years ago when I was doing children's mental health work, but we always have to make a differentiation between a child who may be having petit mal seizures where they seem like they're not there for a little bit, and a child actually who's experienced trauma and is dissociating and losing time. And usually when you ask a child directly about, oh, where did you just go there? Or, you know, they can talk with you about it. So it's different. Okay. So again, I've talked about this before, but particularly when we're thinking about mental health services, it's really important to put this within a cultural context for the families that we're working with and how wellness and mental health are viewed, and what practices are used and seem to be helpful. And certainly with many survivors who are immigrants or refugees, they may hold very different beliefs about what it means to have mental health services based on their country of origin and how that played out. So it's always really helpful to think about that and figure that out together. And then in general, when we're thinking about mental health services, to realize that they continue, unfortunately, in our country to be stigmatizing and labeling and objectifying. And so we have to be conscious of how people are understanding the referrals and what their experiences have been. So I think that it can be very helpful for younger children to get services with their parents if they're 6 or younger. It's really considered kind of a best practice. I know from talking to folks around the country that we don't have enough of those services available, but it makes sense. I get concerned and a little worried when we've got a 3-year-old getting services on their own and it's kind of removed from working with the parent, because again, I really see the parent, a protective parent, as the most important resource for this child's development. And so it's helpful then if there are misperceptions and if there are vulnerabilities that come out of experiencing, for instance, like domestic violence, traumatic experiences together, then it's helpful to address them together, particularly with young children and their parents. And it's also helpful in a situation where if a parent is really numbed out and disconnected, in part because she is experiencing trauma response to the domestic violence or other trauma, then it's helpful to be able to intervene in that way and to offer support and to reconnect. And I think when we talk a little more about families involved in the child welfare system, we can talk some about harsh discipline. Okay, so then the next major system is collaborating with schools, and I said a little bit before about how intimidating schools can be for parents, and how important it is for us to have those local connections or strategic connections if there are many, many schools within the communities that you're serving. I think that it's really helpful when we get permission from parents to talk with teachers and counselors and other school personnel about how domestic violence may be impacted. So I gave the example of the child that was hyperactive in the school, wanted medicated. So to be able to bring that perspective in when we're working with schools. And many schools, particularly with the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, have begun to think about being more trauma-informed, and I applaud them, and I think that's wonderful that there are school systems that are embracing this, but as we know, many, many don't. So I think that in addition to resources that parents might have if they're going through a contested individual education plan, et cetera, that there may be some ways in which in our roles we can support survivors to communicate with teachers and other school personnel. And often at an individual education plan meeting or a 504 plan, which is, again, these are both federally mandated services that children are entitled to, and the 504 plan really talks about accommodations for children's learning, and it's a little less involved than an individual educational plan. But if you're working with children and families and you're not familiar with this, then it's really helpful to learn about it, to find out the resident person within your organization that knows about it, or to reach out and find out, and so that you've got this information that you can share with parents and figure out with them what kinds of supports they need. Because it could be possible that you'll go to a school meeting with a parent, and just your presence there feels empowering and it's helpful. So again, parents can invite whomever they wish to in most schools, as far as I know. So thinking about that, and also just I know that, again, I don't know if it's different throughout the country, but often you have to advocate really hard to even get an evaluation done for a child in school. And many times kids are at risk of repeating a grade or other things kind of come up, and it can take 6, 7, 8 months to get a plan in place. And I also would encourage you to think about and learn more about what comes up within your local school districts and systems, because oftentimes, in my experience, it can be helpful to bring in a specialist, and you'd have to look at, again, that can be expensive for families, but there may be dollars, wraparound type dollars that are out there that you could use, where you would like this child evaluated by a neuropsychologist, for instance, because the level of evaluation that's going to be done at the school level often doesn't go far enough. That's just my opinion on this. Others may have had different experiences, but I want to put that out there. And usually most school systems do have written materials, I think they're mandated to, around what that evaluation process is about and what it looks like. And hopefully it should be in the language that the family that you're working with speaks as their first language, and if not, to figure out a way to get that information to them. Okay. So now we're going to switch to talking about preparing survivors for family court and supporting their children during the process. And we know from our experiences that one of the most overwhelming situations for a domestic violence survivor may be going to family court. in that process of getting a permanent order of protection or in a contested custody hearing. And so we know that the policy, the legal policy, the law policy in most states rests on the belief that children should have frequent and ongoing contact with both parents, unless there is some clear and compelling reason, such as founded abuse, etc., not to. And there's some research that's come out on this, and I think in theory it makes sense for children to have contact with both parents, but we also know that there are deleterious type effects emotionally that take place that probably don't rise to a legal standard. So parents may have very different views of what's in the best interest of their children. And we do also have studies that have shown us that men who are engaged in abusive partnerships tend to request full custody more frequently than their nonviolent counterparts. So dads who are in abusive partnerships at least twice as often want to get full custody. And I think the prevailing wisdom around that, or the way most of us understand that, is that custody then becomes used as another way of threatening or controlling their nonviolent partners. So this is very loaded. I think anytime we talk about this, it's loaded for us as providers, no matter what our role is. And some of you on the webinars may be directly involved in the court system, and many of you are involved in the domestic violence system. So let's talk some more about this. Okay. Okay. So here's just some kind of collective wisdom, I guess, in terms of the experience. And again, it depends. Some agencies are small, domestic violence agencies are small, and you're going to have the same person carrying multiple roles. Other folks may have legal advocates in their domestic violence program who do the court work with survivors. I guess what I would say is no matter what your role is, it's important to somehow figure out how to support survivors going through this process. So if you can walk, through, if she's interested in this, does she want to visit the courthouse ahead of time and go and see where things are going to take place? And then being really explicit about the ways in which you can be supportive, what you'll be doing, what she can expect from you. Okay, I think this is, I really cannot stress enough how difficult this process is, and all of you that have been through this know this, that it's so important for us to try to normalize and anticipate the fact that it's going to be extremely difficult, overwhelming, and scary, or it brings up a tremendous amount of feelings for the survivor when in the courtroom and having to look at and face her abusive partner. And so sometimes survivors can bring friends or family that they have that will be there in the courtroom with them, and they can look at them, and they can not look at the abusive partner, etc. So there are ways to try to manage some of what's going to come up. But it's really helpful to anticipate how the survivor might be feeling or reacting in this situation, and also to have enough time so that you can kind of approach this in small doses, because it may feel so anxiety-provoking to even think about it that it's hard to talk about or contemplate. So I think then that becomes a great opportunity to do some of what we've talked about in terms of remembering and practicing together some of those things like deep breathing or other tools or techniques that we've talked about to help us stay calm. If the deep breathing is not helpful, then other ways to feel grounded or empowered. And, you know, I was thinking that most people these days have cell phones and they've got pictures on their cell phones. And so I think, you know, I can imagine a survivor in court having, and either before she goes into the courtroom or whatever, but looking at pictures of her children and having that there and keeping that in mind as a way that's centering and grounding. Okay. So the first dot point is really difficult because there's a lot of anger and frustration that can come up in the process, particularly if custody is being used as a way to continue to punish or control the survivor. And so really being able to take a step back and reflect on what the strengths and limitations might be of their children's relationships with the children's parent who's been the abusive partner. And I think that we want to be realistic about this as well, because if there's been a high level of danger and lethality and in the relationship, and their fears about what will happen during visitation, then that's got to get talked through as well before going to court. If her role has been continually undermined and she has not had a chance to really parent in the way that she wants to, it may be harder for her or him to sort through what their strengths or limitations are of the abusive partner. And I think the one other thing that's important to keep in mind is that part of the survivor's adaptation may be to minimize or deny the impact of the abusive partner's behavior on the children. And so this is asking then for something different. And so I think when we can keep that in mind, that's really helpful. There are ways in which, in my experience, survivors have been so undermined, though, that it's infuriating and there's fear, but there's also anger. And so really thinking about how to manage those intense emotions that are so normal and typical, and still get move towards what's going to be in the best interest of the children. I think the other thing that can happen is that a survivor may feel so frightened, and we do know that risks can escalate during the process of separation, and particularly in the custody process. So there are fears that can be very well-founded in terms of, if I press too much for what I want, is it going to make it worse? Is it going to be more? Are we going to be less safe in the end? And so really having to sort through those very, very difficult set of feelings and situations. And I think it's important to know that those things might shift or change with time as well. And but we also can be there to support a survivor who might find herself agreeing to visitation and custody arrangements that she really doesn't feel are in her children's best interest, but feels pressured. Oh, trying to, okay. So I think I've talked about the first two dot points and what I've said earlier, but it is helpful for any of us when we're doing something that really takes a lot of courage to be able to envision what we're taking a stand around. And that can be very healing as well. Seen a lot of survivors really come out of this process feeling differently about themselves and what they've been able to accomplish. And the last dot point is just understanding what their rights are. And again, different states may have different regulations around mediation and mediated agreements. But again, to know that and to figure out what her options are. I think we don't often think about, particularly if it's an agency that might have a legal advocate that's working with a survivor, with the adult survivor, we don't always think about this aspect of how are we helping and preparing children for the visitation that's going to follow and the custody arrangements that are coming up. And so I think it's really important to be able to engage survivors in a conversation about this. And often, in my experience, they're really happy to have that opportunity. Yeah, I'm not sure what to say to my 4-year-old or what to tell my 12-year-old about this. And again, if they're children in varying ages within the family, really thinking about what's a developmentally sensitive way of talking about what's going on. Now, and I think that the sort of guidelines around this are more emphasizing safety, emphasizing the role of continuity with the protective parent and or other familiar, trusted adults in the child's life or children's lives. I think for young children, it's really best to explain what's going to happen without too much time, going on. So once the visitation or custody arrangement is settled, to be able to then talk about it, but in very simple terms. So I know for many survivors, if there have been incidents or situations after separation where there's violence towards the survivor when they go to drop off their children, when they go to pick them up. We know that those are sort of danger points, and they might make arrangements to do the drop off and pick up in the parking lot at the police station, etc. So being able to explain what's going to happen, why, very simply why it's going to happen. So mommy's going to take you and let's say, your sister to daddy's house, and then you're going to have dinner, you're going to go to bed, talking about, for a young child, really stepping them through what's going to happen. You're going to take your blankie with you. Mom's going to give you this, little action toy that you like to play with that you can keep in your pocket. For older children, it's helpful to think about some safety planning during the visit, if it's an unsupervised visit, which most of them are. And so really kind of thinking through that process, talking about what's happening, with older kids, talking about what's happening in the court process and why it's taking place, and looking at safety, and making sure that that's understood in terms of what the survivor's intentions are, and then really allowing children to talk about what their fears are, what their hopes are, allowing kids to have positive feelings about the person who's been an abusive partner, who has done awful things, and knowing that they may still have that sort of excitement and enthusiasm about being with them. So I think that can happen with younger kids through play, talking, drawing. But again, it's not something that'll happen once or for all, because it really depends on what those experiences are like and what comes up. I mentioned this in an earlier webinar, but these are some resources that you can check online from our website. And before we end this section, I did this in an earlier webinar, can't quite remember which one, but we've talked about these on-the-go practices that we can use, and I see that Jen just gave you all a link to this if you haven't seen it before. But what I love about this practice that, and you can read more about it, that was based on, we adapted it, Jen adapted this from Kapositar. But what's helpful is that it's something that you can do that it's not really noticed by others. So if you look at this picture, if I'm feeling really anxious and worried, I can take my left hand, because I am right-handed. You probably prefer one hand over another, but and you have to kind of play around with this. And I can wrap my fist firmly, but not too hard, around my ring finger, and take some deep breaths. And I can hold my hand in my lap. So I've told others about the fact that I had a dentist at one point who was really pretty awful, and I was waiting for him to come back in for a procedure, and I just took my hand and wrapped it around my ring finger and just kind of breathed for a while, and I felt calmer. So these are things that are not only for, we were thinking about the court situation, but that can be used in other situations, and that parents can teach to their children. Okay. So we're going to take a moment now to pause here. And okay, Jen brought me in a few of the questions that came up. So Melody asked, when you say we were talking about mental health referrals for children 6 and younger and their parents, and so she asked, when you say together, do you mean both in the session at the same time? And yes, I do. There are trauma-specific treatments such as child-parent psychotherapy that I'm a big fan of that have both parent and child in the room together. The only caveats around that are if a parent gets very flooded and starts dissociating as their child is playing something out, let's say their 4-year-old is playing something out, then we'd have to kind of figure out, the therapist who's skilled in this would figure out ways of working with that, and there might be some individual sessions to support the parent. But I don't think in that situation you would have the 4-year-old in individual sessions, unless the parent absolutely, and you discussed this, was having such a hard time with what was coming up that they couldn't be present for their child, even with your support. Okay. Sarah Hip asked a really great question about children's books on visitation, and I don't know of any offhand, but somebody should write a book, and we'll think about that. If anybody that's listening on this webinar has a resource like that, please share that with us. Let's see. Okay. One other thing that that was a comment that came in that I did want to mention is that if a domestic violence program is thinking about, with a family, about referrals for their child to early intervention, so they're under the age of 3, one of the first things that I would ask the parent is, has your pediatrician said anything to you. So really gathering what's come up from others that might have more expertise in this way. So I think that's a good piece to think about. And I did see another comment here where somebody, this was a ways up, but where somebody was talking about they were not recommending, as a mediator, our court feels, Sheila said, our court feels no police station parking lots, many other public alternatives that are safer. So again, I think that's helpful information to take in. I have worked with families where that being able to do the drop-offs and pickups in the police station was helpful. Again, this was after there had been some fairly frightening events that had happened during that time, and it seemed to be the best solution. But Sheila, if you want to say more about that, and maybe we can kind of chat about that at some other point, I would like to hear more on that. So with that, we are going to move on to the last section, which is supporting families involved with the child welfare system. Oops. So I talked about this in regards to custody, but it also comes up quite often where abusive partners are really trying to control their partners by threatening to call child welfare or other authorities as a way of gaining control and power. So I think one of the hardest things for us to deal with in the domestic violence community may be when we're seeing a family where there's domestic violence, a clear pattern of domestic violence, and child abuse or neglect is also experienced at the same time. Again, different states are going to have different laws regarding what to do in these situations. But again, as I talked in the very beginning about collaborations and different missions, values, and norms that we're going to see between child welfare and the DV system. So involuntary versus voluntary, and the very real threat of loss of custody or parental rights. So in those situations where both are happening at the same time, there's a wide array and continuum of situations, but I think that we find ourselves then in a position of holding a lot of ambiguity and complexity, and not always having sort of clear action paths either. And we're kind of thinking or considering risks and benefits for children and survivors and families, and also weighing that against what our mandated role might be, if we have a mandated role to report. I think we do know, though, that once children are involved in the child welfare system and there is domestic violence that's also taking place that hopefully is not the reason why the child is in the system. But we do know that domestic violence survivors are often not understood. Their concerns are not heard. So as an example, there's a court date coming up, and information about where the survivor may be is given to a former abusive partner who's the father of one of the children, let's say. And then that leads to stalking or something else. So it's kind of like there's a lot of opportunity for cross-system education and conversations, etc. So we don't want her safety to be further compromised, and often survivors themselves get cited for poor parenting when their actions aren't understood in the context of trying to protect their children. And so I think we can be helpful if we're interfacing with the child welfare system, and I know some states do have co-located services where you've got a domestic violence specialist who's working within the local child welfare, child protective services system. But if that's not the situation and that hasn't taken place, I think a couple of common things that come up with that survivors have talked about if their children are involved with the system is that their actions get misunderstood as poor parenting when, for instance, they tried to placate their partner or agreed with him and to avoid angering him further or provoking a further assault on herself or the children. Sometimes survivors may discipline their children more severely to avoid worse punishment or abuse by their partners. So again, those may seem very obvious to us if we're working within the domestic violence community, but not always like kind of common knowledge in the child welfare system. And so it's important to have that perspective and to share that. And certainly we know from survivors that they feel like they're victimized through the domestic violence relationship, but then they're the ones that are held responsible. And they're the ones that have to go to parenting classes. And that whole piece around not holding abusive partners accountable. Now, there's a lot of ambiguity, though, and that's where the holding the ambiguity comes in, because we may think from the information that we have that a father has been an abusive partner. He may have a very different story that he tells child welfare that's very convincing. And so we have to live with, hold that, and at the same time begin to educate and figure out how we can support safety for survivors and their children. So I think that's one of the things that continues to part of the work that we're doing and that we have to look at. And so what's the research on this? So we see that there's really a high correlation between domestic violence, children experiencing that in their homes, and then being more at risk for some form of child abuse or neglect by the woman's abusive partner, at least in the studies that Adelson put together more recently. There's also a correlation which makes sense to me between more severe domestic violence and child neglect in terms of the protective partner being more incapacitated when there's ongoing assaults or there's a higher level of lethality, or sometimes being forced to or using substances as a way of continuing to cope and survive, which can then lead to situations in which children aren't protected and are neglected in that sense. We also know that the risk of sexual abuse for girls is increased sixfold when domestic violence is present. And I think that figure actually is probably smaller than, and again, this may be more anecdotal, but I think about over the years that I've worked with families where girls talk about it's not direct child sexual abuse per se, but as they reach puberty, having the abusive partner who's their parent, might be a step-parent, it might be a father, making comments about their breasts, saying other things that are embarrassing and damaging to their privacy. And so there's those kinds of ways in which boundaries get violated that may not rise to the level of the legal standards of child sexual abuse, but that are nonetheless very concerning and can be damaging without intervention. So this summarizes what I was talking about, and I think that I'm sure everyone on this call can think about a dilemma that they've faced where they may hold concern for a child's safety, and at the same time it's so complicated because we don't know what will happen after report's made, right? At the same time, we want to protect children's safety. So I think there are a couple of patterns that may come up more commonly. So a survivor asks for services from our agency, and we find out in the process she may have been injured, but then one of her children was also hurt. And so if we're mandated to report and we want to protect the safety of the child, we do need to report. It goes into Child Protective Services. And the risk is, depending on what state we're in and who takes the report, that the children would be taken from her as a result of that. And some states have used the phrase failure to protect, which basically ends up blaming the victim. And it's not good for children either to be separated from their protective parent. Then the other kind of dilemma that we may face is, and I think this is more common in shelter-based programs, is when we see or may witness or hear direct abuse, that a survivor is a physical abuse of a survivor towards her child, where there are marks or there are things that would rise to the level of a report. Or there are situations where, due to substance use, there may be neglect and risk of harm to the child. And so, it's so important that we have colleagues to think about with this and not just to feel like we've got to take action. On the other hand, if a child's safety is being compromised, to be able to have that really difficult conversation with the survivor, if she's herself using harsh discipline, to talk about how that's harmful and how that that the child could get seriously hurt, and what are the alternatives, et cetera, et cetera. And also then, this leads to child abuse reporting. So knowing the laws, if you're a mandated reporter, following your agency protocol, not doing anything until you can consult with a supervisor or a senior peer that's in your program, so that you're not acting alone. And then, when possible, if it's the latter situation that I talked about, to really be able to involve the parent in that report, and to if the parent's willing to make the report with you to the hotline, and then to the CPS hotline, and then to be able to advocate to the extent that you can around, this parent has sought services to make herself and her family safer. Here are the strengths that I see in her as a parent and the family strengths in general. We're working with them, et cetera, so that it's a process in which we're maintaining and continuing to offer support to the survivor. Sometimes in that first situation that I talked about, CPS may not take, Child Protective Services may not take the report if it's a situation in which there's the family is now in a shelter and is safe, et cetera. So then we need to help work with them around additional safety planning. And or I should add that if in fact it leads to incarceration of the abusive partner because of what's happened to a child, that really thinking that through, because it can, you know, the danger can escalate when that person is back in the community. Okay. So I want to talk about, just really quickly, about guidelines for talking with children and involving parents. And I think everything that I've talked about says that we want to involve the protective parent if we've got a concern. So if a 9-year-old or 10-year-old is in group counseling services and says, as an example, my stepfather comes into my bedroom at night and touches me in my privates, then after that group is over, hopefully being able to talk with the child about involving their protective parent in a conversation, and then you take it from there. The parent may be shocked but ready to take action. They may blame themselves and have a hard time and feel overwhelmed and not be able to take it in, or they may say, I don't believe her, or I don't believe him. So again, that's sort of a starting point to think about how we might offer services. And then I think there are times where we have a sense that there might be abuse going on, and we're holding that concern, but it hasn't come up directly. So we'd want to work with that. I've seen that with teenage girls in particular who are cutting or very depressed, and I have a sense that there might be child sexual abuse happening at home, but it hasn't been disclosed. And kids can sometimes have loyalty conflicts too. Younger children, I've seen that with. If I tell, then I'm bad, it's my fault, and my dad's going to go to jail, and our family won't be together anymore. I also want to say that there's one other caveat here, which is that sometimes we may think that a child's presentation is such that we think there's been child sexual abuse when there is also DV going on in the home, but it may not be direct abuse. It may be exposure to pornography. The abusive partner may be watching pornography that the child sees, and or the child has seen sexual assaults on their parent, and that they can present similarly. I think we've talked about most of this. The last dot point that I think is important is that it's really important for us to be caring and supporting of the parent, and really empathically being there and understanding what might have led to behavior that is unsafe, but being transparent about that and talking about that. And sometimes in my experience over the years, I found that that can become a turning point in my relationship with a family that I'm working with, and that it's ultimately seen as something that was really important because I cared enough about everybody to bring it up and to make sure that the child would be safe. As you're thinking about that kind of cross-sectional work, I think that the Green Book Initiative, and there are many, many resources there that if you haven't already explored, I think will be quite helpful. I would encourage you to look at that site if you haven't already. And our time is really coming to an end. So I want to just make one summary statement before I turn this back to Erin, that when we have permission from survivors to share our knowledge and understanding, that it can really help in terms of accessing services and systems for children and for survivors, and that they can better understand the needs, the complex and individual needs, and also have a more kind of textured understanding of why a survivor might make a decision that she's made, and also a way of conveying what the survivor's strengths are again, getting back to being able to shore up that relationship. Our next and final webinar in this series is going to be on sustaining trauma-informed family-centered services, and we're also going to invite you and encourage you to ask questions and maybe to kind of do a second look at things that we didn't have enough time on that you're interested. But we'll also talk about reflective supervision and practice next month. And Erin, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Susan. I'd like to thank Susan Blumenfeld for such an exceptional webinar today. Thank you to Caption Colorado for providing today's captioning, and thank you to Jen Curley for making the webinar run so smoothly. Last but not least, thank you all for spending your time with the center. Within the next week or so, I will send you all a follow-up email with a link of the recording of today's webinar, in addition to the slides and handouts that Susan referenced, all of which will be available on our website. You'll also receive a certificate of attendance for your time today. At the end of the webinar, as soon as you close out, you'll be taken to a very brief evaluation. If you could please take a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better, it would be greatly appreciated. Thanks again, and we hope you all have a great afternoon.